Oh wait, let me grab my water. Water acquired. And ready the podcast. I'm Austin Lugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
I think I have a very interesting relationship with this film in particular. And I think this about a lot of films that I watched in that very specific time of my life when I was in film school, which was only a very short time. I was only in film school for 6 months. And it was this extremely hectic and chaotic moment where I took as many classes as I could physically take. I mean, I was at the school from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., 7 days a week. And for those 6 months, like film was my life. It was the most intense. And there was no one there. I lived in Denver, Colorado. So you weren't
Mm-hmm.
there. Emily wasn't there. My parents weren't
Right.
there. Her parents weren't there. It was almost an isolating experience. And in some ways it was very thrilling and exciting. In some ways it was very lonely and depressing. And one of those experiences of that, which is after I would be at school all day, it was about an hour drive to and from school. So I wouldn't get home till like 6:30. And I lived in this little studio apartment. All it really had was a bed, a dresser, and a bathroom. And that's pretty much it. There's no
Mm-hmm.
kitchen, no living space. It's just this extremely small. It was maybe like 800 square feet, probably less than that, probably closer to like 5 or 6. And at night, because I didn't really have a whole lot of friends. I mean, I had my film school friends, but I saw them all day. So to see them after
Mm-hmm.
school just seemed like a lot. And so at night, I would make dinner on this little like cooking stove thing, like one you just plug in. It's like a little heating
Yeah,
pad,
hot plate.
basically. A hot plate, yeah. I would plug in my hot plate. I
You
would
cook
cook
your
myself
can of beans
my
on the hot
basically I'd
plate.
have like rice
Yeah.
and chicken because I was so
Right.
goddamn poor.
Right.
And so I cook my rice and chicken and I put it in this giant bowl. I only had one bowl. And I would sit down and I'd watch a movie every night.
Yep.
And one of the movies that I watched, and I watched this movie over and over again when I was in film school, was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Okay, I didn't realize you watched it over and over again.
Because the first time I saw Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, I was in high school. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason I watched it is because my parents actually got me a Blu-ray copy for my 16th birthday because they're like, it's a black and white movie and it's Criterion, so you'll like it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so the reason I watched that movie in film school so much is because it reminded me of home. It reminded me
Mm-hmm.
sort of this moment in time. Not a very
It's
light
it's
movie.
it, it's not a
It's
very
really dark.
comforting movie in my opinion, but yeah, I see what you mean. Like, whatever. Yeah.
So there's a lot of emotions almost that come
Sure.
with
Yeah,
this,
that
this
sounds good.
film. And I haven't watched it since I was in film school, so I haven't seen this film in 7 years. So it's been a while since I've
Jeez.
seen this film. And so coming back to this experience, an experience I haven't had in a long time, there were a lot of emotions that came up that didn't really have a whole lot to do with the film itself, had more to do with my
Yeah, that's
relationship
fine. Yeah.
with the film.
Yeah.
However, I still think from a merely cinematic standpoint, it still holds up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good movie. I think it's quite good. Yeah, I think for me, I think the thing about the movie that I love, just right off the bat, is it's so fucking funny. It's like hysterical. I love how funny it is. I will say, like, for me, the first like 45 minutes or so of the movie are like perfect.
Yeah.
Like it's a perfect 45 minutes. That's before they like go to the
They leave the
swing,
house. Yeah.
yeah, to like talk the two the Richard Burton character and the George Siegel character. I like seeing George Siegel like so young. Um, he died recently. He died a couple years ago. He's in a great movie. He's in a great Robert Altman movie with Elliot Gould called California Split from like
Mm.
74. And it's like a really good gambling movie with like Elliot Gould and George Siegel, and they're trying to get away with like ripping off people or trying to make money or whatever.
Yeah.
It's very, very funny. Um, but yeah, he's also good in this movie too. Um, but yeah, I would say like the film kind of slows down at that point, right? Like a little
Hmm.
bit, and then I feel like and it's still really good. But again, I just think those first 45 minutes are just like an onslaught. It's so punctuated. It just keeps on going and going and going until like yeah, like George, the Richard Burton character, like smashes the glass. Because like his wife is badgering him. Um, so yeah, I just uh it's just one of those things. It's just one of those movies too, where it's like, you don't need a lot to make like a really great movie. Obviously it's adapted from a play. That's so that obviously helps. But yeah.
Yeah, the writing in here is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, there's so much in here that is so easy to miss because a lot of those jokes are kind of these one-off little, a lot of puns too, right? A lot of references
It's
and
crazy.
puns and just like these things that are so, and even watching it, having seen it so many times, even watching it 7 years later, being a bit older and understanding a little bit more about the world, you can see a lot of things differently. And you just like every time you watch, and I think this is the reason why I've rewatched it so many times. And
Hmm.
I'm not a huge fan of rewatching movies. There are very few movies that I've watched more than two times. Probably count the amount of films on one hand. But I think the reason this one
Crazy.
is so rewatchable, different from maybe like
Hmm.
Playtime, which is another one of my most rewatched films, where Playtime is there's so many visual aspects going on. You can just visually, you always catch something new. This is sort of the dialogue. Every time you hear it, you get something new out of it because there's this
Yeah, I
clever
agree.
little one-liner that Richard Burton will say or Elizabeth Taylor will say, and it doesn't seem to connect with anything else, and yet it works perfectly. And
Hmm.
you just have to take, I mean, you almost have to pause and like take the time to kind of consume all of this. It's almost
It goes so
overwhelming
fast.
the experience because it's so
Hmm.
quippy in those first 45 minutes for sure. I mean, even before George Siegel and his wife show up to the house, just him and Elizabeth Taylor, it's just moves so quickly, and that
Hmm. So good.
relationship that the two have, like it's just perfect. I mean, it,
I love too. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
was gonna say I love where the movie like starts, right? Like there it's a movie made today would do would kind of start at maybe like at the beginning of the night.
Hmm.
I like that this movie starts in the middle of the night. Like they were just at another party, like a polite, probably university party, right?
Hmm.
Like university staff party, and now they're back home. And for some reason, they've invited this like young couple to come to hang out with them for whatever reason. Like there's just whatever, I guess. Um, and yeah, they're already like pissed off. Like they're already drunk
Are
and they
in a
just
bad
keep on getting
mood.
drunker and drunker. This is a good example of a movie like why this is a good argument for why you should abstain from alcohol. Like it's a really good argument for that, this movie, because everybody just gets drunk and they get more angry and they become more petty and sick and everything. Like it just keeps on getting worse and worse and worse. Like it doesn't solve issues, it makes everything worse.
Hmm.
And yeah, I just love how like it starts just like in the middle of the night and everybody is just like already like pissed off.
They're already pissed off. They're already absolutely wasted. So basically,
Yeah.
every character in this film, which there's four characters, and there's only two other actors in the film. Two, three? Yeah, I don't think there's two other actors in the film at all. So they really hold this
Barely.
film together. And
They're
yeah,
like
they're
not
barely. I
actors.
don't even know if they have a
It's just
line.
no, they don't. It's like there's like two like actors, like two humans, like two other
They're
humans
barely
besides the
two
four
other
of them are in
humans.
the movie, and that's pretty much it.
And I think this is such a great decision. And you talk about this idea that if this film was made today, or if it was just made by a different director, we would start at the party and you'd have all these people talking, and you'd add all these different characters that just don't add anything to the piece. And I think part of the
Hmm.
value of only having our four characters here is it feels so isolated wherever they go. I mean, when they drive
Yeah.
to the bar, it just everything's completely empty. There's no
It's
one
so
else on the
dark.
road. There's
Like
no one
yeah.
else on this university campus. It feels like they're absolutely alone in the world and even alone from each other. And whenever they shoot outside, just the pitch black darkness that encompasses them and engulfs them, and it feels like it's going to consume them completely and they can't escape it. And whenever you're inside that house, I mean, that house itself is so cluttered and there's just so
Yeah,
much
it's a great
shit
house.
everywhere. It just feels so claustrophobic and you never get to leave the house. And every time you walk out of the house, you get these slower moments. I mean, like the moment where they go out to the swing and Richard Burton and George Siegel are talking about Richard Burton's childhood and all of that stuff.
Yeah,
There's
about the
this
like the
much
killing, about the
about the
student that he knew that killed his parents.
quote unquote, right?
Yeah, someone he knew. My friend.
Yeah, my friend. And yeah, even that opening before we see the two is brilliant because we capture everything we need to know about this relationship. I think does a great way of building anticipation, stakes, and also exposing our exposition without any of that having to explain anything. I mean, all everything that we learn about these characters is through their arguments. We learn that her father is the head of the department through an argument. We learn that Richard Burton is not the head of the history department through an argument with George Siegel, and we learn that George Siegel is a biology professor because
Yeah, they
of
snipe at each other. Everybody's
Mhm.
like they're constantly sniping at each other, making themselves like they're trying to make each other like seem small.
Yeah, except for George Siegel's wife. I can't remember her
It's Honey.
name. Honey?
Yeah, I like the character a lot because there's
Honey's
something very
name.
like Midwestern about her. Like she has a
There
very like
is. I
Midwestern
love
like
it.
disposition in the way she talks. She's really
Mhm.
funny. She made me laugh a lot. Um, everybody's really funny. Um, Richard Burton has like a lot of like really great lines. He's a very, Welsh, like serious actor guy.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Taylor is like very hysterical. She's really, really, really like she goes all the way with her role. She just like is like I don't know. She's just like has like her ups and her downs and all this stuff. Like
Mhm.
she's so good in the movie.
Yeah, her
It
performance.
probably also adds to the fact that they were married at the time.
Yeah. And it definitely reflects their tumultuous relationship in real life. So it's this weird art
Yeah,
reflecting reality. So a great choice in casting here of having
yeah,
Richard
amazing.
Elizabeth Taylor because
It's
I
like the
don't
best possible like
it
it's
truly
like the
is.
best. Yeah, it probably didn't do. I'd imagine like the movie probably didn't do anything to improve their relationship in any
I
way.
imagine
Like I
not.
imagine like they finish this movie, it's a big success. It like wins and is nominated for a bunch of awards. But I
Mhm.
imagine their relationship was worse because it's just like they're at their necks the whole movie. Like
Mhm.
they're just constantly like badgering each other in the entire movie. They're yelling at each other. Um, you know, she's like emasculating him.
Yeah.
He's like like he almost tries to kill her like in the course of the movie. Like it's just and I can and the idea of the young couple there, right, is to kind of like sort of like um I don't know, serve as like a reflecting element,
Mhm.
right? If it was just the two of them, um the movie necessarily wouldn't progress the way that it does, right?
Yeah.
So obviously you need like another couple for them to kind of like reflect off of, like for them to like kind of imagine, like, yes, I remember when I was young and in
Mhm.
love and all this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, you need that younger couple there not only to reflect this idea of what life used to be or what life could have been like. Here's the dream version of ourselves. Here's this version that we
Mhm.
wish we would have become, the things that we wish we did so we didn't end up the way we are now. And of course, that younger couple sees in them sort of this terrifying version of themselves, this version in
Mhm.
which that they're going to end up like this, right? They're just going to end up in this middling relationship and their careers are sort of stuck. They're staggered. They don't go anywhere. And it also, a problem when you only have two characters in a room, especially if they're married, is they can't really have the kind of arguments that you get with those other two characters because now they have to explain
Mhm.
stuff, right? It's the idea of the naive protagonist and being able to explain, here's what's going on, here's like the arguments in the relationship. So you can bring up things like their son and it but it doesn't work if it's just the two of them because you don't, right, you can't really grasp that as a viewer, but by having the people who don't really know them, which I mean it has to be
Right.
people that they've
They don't
never
know
met
anything about him.
before. It doesn't work if
Yeah.
they're like their best friends, right? That because then as a viewer we just don't know what's going on or they have to write in a way that doesn't fit. By having this
Yeah.
naive
It's
protagonist as it
classic.
were, then we suddenly understand everything
Mhm.
that's going on. And
Yeah.
speaking of the son, at what point did you figure it
Mhm.
out?
Well, no, I didn't figure out about it at all. Like
Oh, really?
like I would, well, yeah, I was gonna say like later on that like I figured considering like the Richard Burton like close up reaction of when he realizes that Martha has like brought up their son
Mm-hmm.
to Honey. I was thinking like what the can you is it okay?
I can
Hello?
I can still hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that was
Okay.
weird. My computer went to sleep randomly. Sorry. Anyway,
Yeah.
um
Well, you're like all
weird.
wavy.
Yeah, I don't understand what the fuck is going on.
It's very strange.
Wait, let me do this. That was really weird. I don't understand what
That
happened.
was
Anyway,
weird.
here, let me start over. Um, yeah, when like when would I figured that considering Richard Burton's like close up reaction when he's reacting to the fact that he realizes that Martha brought up their son, their quote unquote son to Honey, I
Yeah.
figured that the son was dead, like the son like died like very
Mm-hmm.
very young, and it was
Mm-hmm.
like his fault or their fault or something like that, and so they feel really guilty and shitty about it. I really was not, and that's kind of what happens in the movie, kind of, but they
Mm-hmm.
take it a step further and that like that I was not expecting the extra step of the fact that not only is the son quote unquote dead, but he never existed in the first place. Like
Yeah.
they are like they're so pathetic and sad about the fact that they can't have a kid that they invent one because they're so upset about like and inventing one is better than not having one at all, I guess. To have a
Mm-hmm.
son to imagine or talk about with each other, like, but like the rules is I guess like you can't talk about it with anyone else. And
Yeah.
so she breaks the rule and he gets very upset. Which I think kind of like sets up more of how like insane the movie gets and things like that. So that I wasn't expecting that. I'll admit that. Like I wasn't expecting like the fact that like he didn't exist at all. Like it's like an imaginary friend except a son, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I first time I watched that movie, and even watching now, having been 7 years, it took me a while to remember what the sun was because
Mhm.
even though it's a big aspect of the movie, there's just so much going on in this film, and it's just so strange and weird the way they talk about it. It's so like secretive, and that moment where he kills her is such a, or he kills his son, quote unquote. It's such
Right.
a traumatic moment for everyone involved, and you can
She
see the.
she really feel it's really like she killed him.
I
It's really
mean,
like he
yeah,
killed him.
it's fucking
She's so good.
insane.
She's really really good in the movie. It's
And
crazy how good she is.
one of the things that sticks in my mind every single time that I think about this movie for the last 7 years, since the last time I watched this movie, there's this one scene, if nothing else, there's one scene that I always think about. It just comes up in my head constantly. It's just like playing in the back of my mind, like a little projector. It's that scene where Elizabeth Taylor is talking to the young couple, and Richard Burton walks over to the closet. He opens the closet. He pulls out the gun and he
Yeah, that's such
walks
a
into
good
the
scene.
room and he pulls the trigger. Oh my
Just like
God.
screws, yeah. Yeah, you're just like, oh shit. I guess like there is like a part of you in the back of your mind that's just like, wait, we have the rest of this movie. They all
What's
can't.
gonna
She
happen?
can't. He can't fucking kill her right now. And then you're like, oh, okay, it's a big joke. It's a big, yeah, like that. That's a really great. He did a really good job with that. Like the pacing and like kind of like it's like a slasher movie when he goes in and gets the gun. It
Hmm.
reminds me of like Targets.
Yeah.
Reminds me of that movie as well. Um, and yeah, no, that is a very well done sequence of events there, and I like to. Everyone thinks it's funny. They all like laugh and stuff. They just think it's the funniest thing. And then of course later he actually does try to kill her by like
Mhm.
strangling her at the bar. So that's a very sad state of events that happen from there. Um, yeah, and I like with the young couple, like Nick and Honey. They like they their relationship like gets worse. Like, well, I guess like it's kind of funny because like the movie is funny because throughout the movie, their relationship becomes more strained within a matter of hours, right? Of being
Mhm.
around them because they're so toxic and evil. They like they like bring up things that like George Siegel told to Richard Burton. He
Mhm.
brings it up like like the idea of like her father being like a pastor, like a rich pastor and stuff, and
Mhm.
she and about being pregnant and not being pregnant, and she like gets very upset about like how could you just tell like this random guy like that their personal lives, like a personal history. But I love like when the movie ends and they leave and they realize, and George Siegel realizes that like the sun doesn't exist. I just like that they're both, I feel like they both kind of have this resignation of like, I guess, you know, maybe it's good that we have each other, because these people are actually like
Insane.
have lost it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I like too that like there's also kind of like this thing too of like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, they're crazy too, and so they have
Mhm.
each other as well. Like like and they kind of like talk about that a little bit in the movie, not in the way that I said it, but just kind of how like they talk about each other, like they're disappointed in each other and they basically hate each other, but
Mhm.
they're kind of like made for each other at the same time.
Yeah. Well, there's that great moment, and I think this happens. It does. It happens after Elizabeth Taylor sleeps with George Siegel because she starts calling him the houseboy, and
Yeah,
they're in the kitchen, and she's smoking a
it's after they
cigarette.
have sex.
Yeah, they just had sex, and she says, "There's only one person I ever loved, right? I've
Right,
ever
yeah.
loved before." And he's like, "Oh, who's that?" And she's like, "George, like my husband.
My
Like that's the
husband,
only
yeah.
person I ever loved." And
Right.
and in that moment, like it all makes sense. It's like they hate each other to the core, and they are so toxic, right? They are these two evil human beings
Yeah.
who could not hate any other human being, and yet simultaneously they have this codependency where they legitimately love each other and need each other. They cannot exist without, like, they cannot imagine a world where they exist without the other person. That is just physically impossible to them. And so they feed off of each other's toxicities. And I guess it's good that they found each other, that there's someone just as toxic, but then also they've
Right.
turned each other into these things because we have to assume that when they first got to the college, they were like Nick and Honey at the beginning. They were just this lovely young couple. He was going to take up the history department and he was going to write his great novel and he eventually was going to become the president of the college and all these things. He had all these dreams and aspirations.
Yeah. And
And
then
his
it's gone.
failures to Elizabeth Taylor, those become her failures too. So now whenever she's
Yeah.
emasculating him, which she does in a lot this movie, and this movie is a
Yeah, she
lot
does.
about what it means to be a man, what it means to be quote unquote masculine, especially in this sort of hierarchy of secondary education, right? The idea of
Yeah.
being a professor and in the history department, no less. And it's not a coincidence that he's a history professor, right? He sees the world,
Hmm.
and it's history versus biology, right? The idea of seeing the world
Hmm.
through the lens of looking at our past, understanding humans, or trying to understand our genetics, our genes, sort of the scientific foundation, right? Looking at it from these two different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. And every time he fails, she feels like she fails also because she had all these big plans for what he was going to do because her dad's the president of the college. And so, A happens and B happens and C happens. And she expected this thing for their life. And now they're at this moment where there really isn't any turning back, right? This is the rest of their life. And they're at that point, they're at that kind of middle-aged point where they are realizing that nothing's going to change. I mean,
Yeah, it's
there's
over.
they're not going to have kids, right? He's not going to become the president of the college or even the head of the history department. He's just going to spend the rest of his life doing this. And that's a very terrifying notion to both of them. I mean, it's almost like they're looking at death because if you're not growing, what is the difference between that and death at that
And they
point?
can't have a kid either.
Mhm.
Like they can't have a kid either, so they can't even like pass on like whatever paltry like successes and things that they have. They can't even like pass it on. Again, like they would rather invent, they would rather create like this like figment of their imagination than not have a son at all. Right? Like they and like not having a son at all is like akin to death. And of course, but then
Mhm.
again, of course, they have to kill him anyway because it's gone too far. Right? Like it's gone into a place where it's like you don't necessarily want people that you work with on the university knowing that you have like an imaginary friend son thing. Like that's kind of
Fucking
embarrassing, right?
crazy.
Yeah, it makes you look like really weird. So I can understand. So yeah, like they had to like pull the plug on kind of like this game that they were playing.
Yeah.
Which games is kind of like a theme in the movie.
Hmm.
They play like games, like various games. The Richard George, it's George, right? Richard Burton
George.
is
Yeah.
George. Yeah, yeah, George. Like he's like constantly playing these quote unquote games in which he's making people uncomfortable and feel like shit. Right? They're not really games; they're more just kind of like things in which like to make the other three characters like feel weird or uncomfortable or have to confess something terrible or all these different things. So that's definitely a theme of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that even though throughout their lives they failed in all these things that they wanted to do, they're still making the attempt, right? The whole reason they invite this young couple over in the first place is they're still trying to impress, as Elizabeth Taylor's still trying to impress her father. She's still trying to prove
Yeah.
that George is worthy. George is trying to prove that he is worthy of being more than this. They still keep striving for this thing in this futile effort, almost in this
Mhm.
sort of rat wheel, right? They're kind of running in circles. They just keep doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for something different to happen. And it's very clear that and this young couple's doing the same thing, right? The whole reason that Nick sleeps with Elizabeth Taylor is because he thinks that if I sleep with the
It'll be
president's
better for his
daughter,
job.
it'll benefit, which is
Yeah.
right, crazy, insane. It's a sane thing to think.
Yeah, that
But
guy's an asshole. Like that guy turns out to be an asshole because like he confesses that to George that like he only married Honey because
mhm.
he thought she was pregnant, and hey, also her father's kind of rich,
He's
like kind
somehow
of
the
like
worst.
marrying
He's
him.
somehow
Yeah,
worse.
he's like married. He married her like out of like convenience and
Mhm.
also obligation, right? But then
Obligation.
the obligation falls through, so it's just like like convenience, Um, so it's like kind of like not. He kind of ends up like turning out to be like a huge asshole.
Hmm.
But again, I think by the end of the movie, they kind of like he's like resigned, right? To like, I guess it could be worse. Like he kind of like has this before he leaves, he kind of has this like I guess this a realization like, I think I do love my wife. You can
Mm.
kind of maybe read into that a little bit, at least like that's how I read into it. Um, but yeah, that guy, yeah, he's trying to like, it's the president's daughter, it's like, maybe if I sleep with her, maybe I can do it, like maybe I can, be the head of the biology department or whatever the fuck.
Mhm.
Um, uh, you know, it, like all these people are really fucked up in their own ways.
They're extremely twisted and fucked up. And I think of that moment when Richard Burton and George Segal are at the swing. It's the first time they leave the house, so it's basically the end of an act, as it were, if it were
Yeah.
in a play. And by the way, converting plays into films, I think is rarely done well. I think there's a lot of examples of films that they try to turn into plays that do not work out well
Like
because of,
what? Give an example.
well, oh gosh.
See,
Okay. The, I'm thinking of like Fences. That's the first one that came to my
never
mind.
seen it.
Fences. It's not bad. I think Denzel Washington gives a great performance, but I've seen a lot of plays converted into films. Ingmar Bergman did it. Mike Nichols, of course, did it a lot, and there's a lot of filmmakers that do
Yeah.
it. And typically, the problem is like a play is a very static thing. A play is usually built first and foremost off of the dialogue, right? That's kind of the crux of a play. I mean, it's typically in one place, right? One setting. And so a lot of times when that is converted into film, you get this very sort of stagnant, very slow pace, and it's hard to do well. I think a lot of time you see that they just don't convert well from play to film. If they're a play first, not if they're a film and they become a play. But what this film does well, along with some incredible editing, I mean, I think of that moment where
Yeah.
Richard Burton George is driving completely wasted the car and they're swerving all over the road, and you immediately cut to that shot of Honey spinning around. right? As if like they spun out of control. Incredible editing moment,
Yeah,
and there's tons of those. So like
that's a
that's
good
a
cut.
big part of it, and just the sense of movement in this piece. Even though we have shots that go on for a very long time, and we have a ton of oneers
Sure,
in
yeah.
this where we'll just kind of move from place to place. We're following them around,
Yeah, like it's
but
a good mix of like
I think so. But it's
of
almost the camera's almost
techniques.
never static. It's almost always sort of has this movement to it, and I think you need it in a piece like
Yeah, that's
this
why the
that
first
is.
45 minutes are really good, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the way I think they just, along with everybody, along with how everybody talks and acts and moves around the rooms and stuff like that, I think, yeah, like combining that also with great techniques of like close-ups and editing and all this stuff, it's it's kind of hard to explain, but it's just you're transfixed to it.
Yeah.
Like I said, at least in those like first 45 minutes, and then of course the movie slows down a little bit. But yeah, those first 45 minutes are just kind of like you're just like being thrown around. It's so
Mhm.
good.
Yeah, and I started making this point, and then I went off on a total tangent and never actually got to the original point where George Segal and Richard Burton
No, it's
are out
fine.
by the swing, and George, sorry, okay, this Richard Burton,
Yeah, George
George,
Brolin character.
is telling about sort of this kid that he knew and how he ordered Bergen instead of bourbon. He ordered Bergen, and it sort of goes around the room, and everyone laughs and
Yeah,
uh
they make fun of him.
and make fun of him, blah 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 blah. And Nick asks what happened to him, and uh, Richard Burton says that he went to a mental asylum and never talked again. And of
Yeah.
course, later we learn that that person is him, right? Of course, he didn't go to a mental asylum, right? He made that part up. But this idea that at
Oh, yeah.
that
Also,
moment,
yeah, he
yeah,
also like killed his mom,
his mom,
and he accidentally killed his father in a car accident.
yeah. And it's this idea that he lost himself in that moment and he never felt whole. And it's not really
Hmm.
about the ordering of bourbon wrong, right? It's this idea of it's like that moment where you become conscious of the self, right? And I see this working with teenagers, right? It's that moment where they realize that like they are part of the world and they are seen by the world. They're no longer just, right?
Hmm.
It's no longer just them in the world. Like up to that moment, you can just be you, right? There is nothing else. As a child, as a young adult, like you don't see that in that moment, you kind of get that turn.
Hmm.
Like suddenly you kind of lose a version of yourself. And for Richard Burton, he lost that version and now he kind of pines for this thing that he can never have back. He pines for this life that really never was because of course he's making a ton of shit. I mean, we don't know, and that's what's hard without this piece. Like you don't know what's true and what's not. I mean, there are
Yeah.
just so much right conflicting stories going on simultaneously between what Elizabeth Taylor says and what Richard Burton says that you don't know what's true and what's not. Even at the end when you reveal that the sun isn't real, the sun isn't alive. There's still like so many parts of their past. It's as if they're past in of itself. And that's why I think it's interesting that he's a history
Hmm.
teacher, because in the minds of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, the past is something malleable. It is not something stuck in place, right? It's not like biology where there is science, quote unquote, right? We have a method and this is the proof, this is the evidence, this is what happened. History is constantly recreated, right? Or revisionist history. We're constantly recreating history to match and mold to what we understand about the world now. We're constantly changing the past. Even though the past itself didn't change, right? The way we experience the past is constantly changing. And so too, these two characters are constantly changing their own past in relationship
Hmm.
to how they are living now and
Yeah.
experiencing life now.
He's also like playing like a stupid game. He's also playing a very cruel game, right? Of
Mhm.
like kind of like of like I think he literally says like when he like does it the thing at the bar where he like kind of like exposes the fact that he knows the fact that like Honey has like been pregnant and it turns out she wasn't pregnant. Like I
Mhm.
think he literally says like, haha, I got you, I made you say something personal about yourself, and I
Mhm.
don't even care. Like I don't even care if you know anything personal about me, but
Yeah.
now I can use like what I know about you personally against you because I'm sick like that. Like I'm just like a sick
Twisted
motherfucker.
fuck.
Yeah. because it just I just love like seeing everybody like really upset, and I can feel like I can feel much better about myself.
Yeah. And you talk about how sort of the film slows down after they leave the house for the first time. I think the film, for me, the film really starts to slow down after they leave the bar and they come back to the house. Everything after that even though like that's the part
Well,
where
yeah, yeah,
Nick
yeah,
sleeps with Elizabeth Taylor, like even though that's a sort of a big, that moment really isn't. It's a great moment. I love when Richard Burton walks into the house, right? He kicks the door open and he
and he
starts
like
walking up the
cries
stairs and
and
he
stuff.
sees, yeah, and he sees the clothes on the stairs, which of course are left there purposely, right? It's
Yeah,
exhibitionist, right? It's all for show. Like there's a very
right.
specific purpose for doing this.
Make him feel like shit.
It makes him feel like, and he does, right? He legitimate, like he has like this laugh that like turns into a cry,
Yeah,
and
he's
it's
good.
perfect because he's trying to not feel it, right? He's continuing to build this facade. They both are, right? That they hate each other, right? That they don't love each other. But the truth is, in this weird, dark, and twisted way, they deeply, deeply love each other. And this legitimately hurts him. So that laugh turns into this like bitter and miserable cry that he can't really let go of. But even that, I
Mhm.
think once they get back to the house, I, the pacing to me feels a bit off. It feels like we never sort of get, and it does have to slow down. I think the pacing is just, it's so intense in that first hour, and there's still like another hour and 10 minutes to this film that it's hard to keep up that pace. I
Yeah.
think there's only like 45, 50 minutes once they get back to the house, but all that stuff, it kind of just moves at a different pace. And then you see this, I love that moment where Richard Burton is at the front door, and
Hmm.
Elizabeth Taylor and Nick are in the kitchen, and Elizabeth Taylor demands that Nick go answer the door, right? He becomes the houseboy, quote unquote. And there's this really interesting reversal where instead of where it's someone still being emasculated, but now instead of being Richard Burton, it's now uh, Seagal, right? In the same sense that they're still kind of, she has this need to control. And maybe
Yeah.
when I say emasculate, I don't want it to feel like, like Ray as a man, he should be control of the house or anything like that. Although, she does talk about this idea of wearing, she wears the pants in the family, right? I mean, she literally says, I wear the pants in the family. I do everything. I control everything, right? Uh, she's the head of
Yeah.
the household, but it's more this need to control, right? That to her is like what she needs in life is she needs to control everything. Every aspect of everyone's life needs to be controlled because then she feels safe. And so that there's that interesting reversal where he goes and opens the door, and of course at the door is Richard Burton with the flowers.
Yeah, and I like too when he comes at the door with the flowers is as if like the whole thing with him like sleep with her like sleeping with what's his face? Like that part where he comes with the flowers, they kind of have like this weird moment where they're like singing and stuff like that. And like
Hmm.
again, like that's a good scene because it just again shows just like they are both totally on edge at all times, right? Like they're both insane and they're made for each, it's like she like sleeps with him and then you're just kind of like, oh no, how is he going to recover from this? And he comes with the flowers and stuff, and they have like this big like thing where they're like, like singing and dancing around and stuff like that. Obviously they're in pain, but they're kind of uh like in the George Siegel character is just like what is going on? Like he can't believe like this kind of like weird kind of like a bipolar nature of like the relationship, like these ups and downs. Like it's so extreme, which again I think like is like how their personalities are, and so like they kind of like have like these ups and downs in their relationship, and and you can maybe read into the situation too that maybe she has like slept with other people too
Hmm.
before,
And he has
and maybe
too.
he has too. Yeah,
Yeah.
like that probably has, this is, they don't say it, but I'm reading in that they maybe have,
Hmm.
um but again like you know uh 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 like again they're married to each other, and I guess they don't really see themselves being married to anyone else.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting moment where he brings in the flowers, and somehow the villain at that moment, like Nick, George Segal's character, suddenly becomes the villain. Like they're both taunting him.
Yeah, Yeah.
because of his inadequacy, right? They're like, you're not either you're a
Yeah.
houseboy,
Yeah.
right, and you're not good at making love, or you're a stud and you're not good at anything else. And either way, like somehow Nick is the one being emasculated, which is such a weird and interesting, fascinating twist, and kind of shows the relationship. Like the relationship is so
Uh-huh.
strong between Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor that even when they do sleep with other people, which my assumption is that they do, because Richard Burton talks about you plow your way through the university wives. I mean, he that those are his words,
Yeah.
and she kind of makes references to it too. They never say it openly, but it
Right.
seems like this is something that they do all the time,
Yeah.
which is why in this moment, like it's such a weird interaction. I mean, it's obviously it hurts Richard Burton during the actual event, but post event, it's
Uh-huh.
almost as if they're stronger because of it. Because like both to Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, like that didn't mean anything. Like Elizabeth Taylor really doesn't give a shit about Nick. Like she doesn't have sex with him
Yeah.
because she's in love with Nick, or really even because she wants to have sex with Nick. Like it has nothing to do with Nick at all. The only reason she does it, really, I think, is
Yeah,
because
his
she's
character
trying to
sucks.
hurt, right? She's trying to hurt
Right.
Richard Burton. Like that's all it is. And so Nick's kind of
Yeah.
just like there. He's just this houseboy, uh
Yeah.
this stud, right? He's
The
meaningless to the
stud,
actual
yeah.
conversation, right? And he doesn't get
Right.
that. Like Nick doesn't realize that like you don't matter, right? Because Nick is so caught up in his own shit, right? He's
Mm.
so caught up in like,
Yeah.
trying to be masculine and cool, right? He thinks like, oh, Richard Burton is
Yeah.
the cuckold and I'm the bull, right? He thinks of himself as powerful in that moment, but it's like, no, this isn't about you at all. And the fact that you can't get that like makes you like look stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, yeah. And then yeah, it's like they're even like yeah, it's like he's realizing that they're even more like crazy. They're even more fucked up than he had previously thought. Because it's like he goes into the house to meet the couple, and they're already on edge, yelling at each other and stuff like that. But
Immediately.
but then he continues to realize just how crazy they can be, like, crazy how crazy they really are.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think at the beginning of the movie, like, there's nowhere for this to go. Like, you'd be afraid that they're already drunk,
Yeah,
they're already angry, there's no room, and yet there's still somehow, like, just the escalation is still so intense, even though they're
yeah,
already starting at the place, which is great. I mean, even the opening of the door, the very first time they open the door to the new couple, it's an argument, right? They're arguing with each
right.
other about opening the door until they end up opening the door. And Nick and Honey are immediately, well, Honey's interesting because she's kind of often just her own little
She gets
universe.
very early on she gets super duper drunk and she basically never recovers from that. Like she's drunk throughout the
Yeah,
whole. She says some really funny
completely
lines and stuff
wasted.
though.
She
Yeah,
just
she
so,
she can't handle her liquor at all, unlike the other
mhm.
characters.
and and like you said, she's kind of this. Even though her and Nick are both from the Midwest, she has those sort of Midwest attitudes. I mean, she's just trying to be really nice and fun, and it right. A lot of the stuff they're so cruel to her, right? She's kind of just this punching bag that everyone
Yeah,
treats her as because she's the stupid one, right? She's the one that that doesn't fully understand what's going on, even though she has her own emotions and feelings. And
hmm
there's that moment where we realize that she was terrified of having a kid, and so my assumption is that she had an abortion. Yeah, she had an abortion because
no,
Richard
no,
Burton's. Yeah, because Richard
I
Burton
thought
asked if you took pills or
oh,
remember.
okay. I thought she found out she was pregnant. They got married, and it turns out she didn't. That wasn't actually pregnant. Like it was something that she made up. He calls it
Well,
something like
that's what I think. That's what Nick believes at first, right? That was fake.
okay.
But then there's that moment later on with Richard
Maybe I
Burton
think I missed this then.
and Honey when Seagal and Elizabeth Taylor are sleeping together, like they're
Yeah,
out, and he asks her about the baby, and
yeah,
he asks like how she got rid of it. So
yeah,
I mean maybe it's not real, but like my assumption at that moment because he's like, did you take pills? Did you go to the doctor? Right? What'd you do to get
yeah,
rid of it? It sounds like because like she said, I was afraid of having kids, or I was terrified of having kids.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? So
I,
for me,
that
it's
must have I must have missed that. Again, like this movie, like
there's so much. It's very
there's a lot
easy
of
to miss.
conversations, a lot of dialogue, and the thing about the movie too is that like even though there are only four characters, their interactions you get like an assortment. You get like a bunch of like the movie seems simple, but in reality it's complex because you get a and it would be really hard for anyone to like, I'm impressed with it because it seems simple, but it's really complex because the movie shows you various combinations of different conversations and interactions between the different characters, right? Like you have all four of them together. You have like different combinations of like people talking to this character talking to this character, or this talking character talking to this other character. So you get like different interactions, reactions, dialogue. Um, it becomes kind of like this very kind of like complex web of like the way that people address each other, the way that people feel about each other, the way that a certain person addresses another person, is meant to get like a rise or reaction of another person. Um, Again, it seems simple, but in reality, it's really quite complicated if you're like a person trying to figure out like how you're going to do this, especially since I think the play is like 3 hours long. I read that it's 3 hours long and the
Really,
movie's like over 2 hours long.
2 hours and 10
So I
minutes. Yeah.
mean, so it's like, so it's it again, it seems easy and simple. It's easy for a person to kind of like sit back and be like, oh, I could write a play or a movie where it's just like, oh, I could just write a play of like, or play, like I said, a play or a movie where it's just like three or four people. That doesn't
Hmm.
seem that hard. In reality, it's probably harder. It's definitely harder than it seems, especially if you're at the drawing board trying to figure out how each character is going to be, how they're going to talk to each other, it's just, what their backgrounds are going, it's really quite impressive at that level.
Yeah. This is actually something I've been working on with my creative writing students recently, is sort of the way we work uh, at writing, because I have them for 18 weeks. And so the sort of process is we sort of start with the thing that they struggle with most, which I've noticed that most high schoolers, at least in where I work, the thing that they struggle with most is, especially as writers, is writing that imagery, right? Creating a feeling for where we are. I mean, they're almost always good at plots and stories because that's the stuff they grow up with, right? They watch TikTok, they watch Instagram Reels, they watch movies, they watch TV. Like the plot's
Yeah.
the stuff that they understand. And so imagery is one of the first things that we always work on. And then typically I start with them just building a single character, right? What does this character look like? And we kind of work our way up to a couple of characters, but then you kind of hit this wall where it's like, okay, now it's actually easier to have a lot of characters in here than just a few characters, because the fact is that
Yeah.
when you only have a few characters, like you really have to understand those characters' wants and desires
Yeah.
and their lives, like you do here, right? Like there is so much in here. I mean, so much of their lives is exposed.
Yeah.
These are arguably some of, in my opinion, some of the most realistic characters in cinema history, because their entire lives right
Yeah, they're
there,
really
even though
good.
they don't talk about it, right? We don't see their whole history, we don't see anything else,
Yeah.
and yet we know everything there is to know about these people, right? We know that there's these lives lives in the way that they talk to each other and the way that they never talk straight to each other, which is incredible, and it's a very hard thing to do as a writer. And that's one of the things I admire about this piece, is such incredible
Uh-huh.
writing where whenever they talk about something, that's never really what they're talking about, right? It's always something
Yeah.
else. It's sort of just this facade that, they argue about this or that. And there's also this other thing, which I noticed that they do a lot in the film, is in the dialogue, they're constantly confusing themselves with the other. Do you notice like they do that all the time?
Yeah.
Like he'll say like, oh, like once you had the history department, I mean biology department, right? History department, right? And they do this
Yeah.
constantly throughout the film, as if
Yeah, it's
their
funny.
very idea of the self is this illusion that they cannot hold on to, right? They cannot recognize that this couple isn't them, right? They cannot, they fundamentally like cannot see themselves. Like they do not understand that there are other people that exist in the world.
Hmm. Yeah. I will say I do like the opposite end of the spectrum of this kind of thing too, like a Robert Altman movie or a Paul Thomas Anderson movie,
Mm,
right? like Nashville or Shortcuts or Magnolia or
Mhm.
Inherent Vice or Boogie Nights, where you have like these like really like big casts
Yeah.
and stuff. But because the writing is so good, still like the writing is still like very impressive. Everybody still feels like really fleshed out.
Mhm.
Um, so the way that the movies transpire are really entertaining. But I think either way, whether you have a gigantic cast of characters, like dozens of characters, or if you have like a cast of like four people, either way, it's a challenge because like you still want to like connect to the audience, like you still
Mhm.
want to connect to the viewer, like you want to keep it entertaining and interesting, and you want there to be surprises and great powerful emotional moments and stuff like that. And I think whether you're talking about a movie like Nashville or a movie like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, like they're both very entertaining and have amazing moments and great acting. um and they're incredibly well made. So I think I don't think like I think either way, uh uh whether you have a big or small cast, like the goal is the same, is to try to like reach the audience member and have like a moment with them, first and foremost. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are running up on about an hour now. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up and get into our final thoughts?
No, I mean, I don't think I really don't. I guess I'll just say my
Yeah.
final words,
Yeah.
just that, it's a great movie, great cast, very well made, looks great, just a good straight ahead drama, very complex but yet simple. um when it comes to movie from 1966, it's great. I do like I read this like article in the New York Review of Books
Hmm.
recently, right here, titled like a Diabolical Fame by Francis Wilson. It's about a book called Erotic Vagrancy. Everything about Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. I'm not really interested in reading the book. It sounds kind of gossipy.
Mm.
But the review was interesting and very cool. And I like the last like paragraph of the review. It says uh uh where it like they say like they quote Elizabeth Taylor talking about Richard Burton, that says, if Burton, she once said, were to have a lobotomy, out would fly snakes, frogs, worms, tadpoles, and bats. It's just so like, and I think that kind of like in a way kind of sums up the movie, right? Like,
Mm.
especially like the two lead characters of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, right? Like their brains have like tadpoles and bats and frogs in them, right? Like their minds are like on display for us to see in the movie in a way that's like extremely like propulsive and like explosive.
Hmm.
um and I find that it's a very kind of a satisfying thing to watch. So I will give it a very very good high nice 8 out of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said at the beginning of the piece, I have a lot of baggage when it comes to this film. So it's a very
Yeah, I feel you.
specific experience for me. And so to it's impossible to take that away. And I think that's one of the
Right.
amazing things about movies is even though you are in that moment when you're watching a movie, you're kind of lost from the world, right? You get to escape the world for a couple of minutes, no matter what your worries or troubles are. That's one of the things that I love about it is it's the sort of escapism that just allows you to exist in this moment in a way that I don't think anything else does to the same extent, at least for me. And yet, even though all of that is true simultaneously, and maybe this is some sort of cognitive dissonance going on, I feel whenever I think about a movie that I've seen before, right? No matter the movie, it brings up specific memories of a specific moment in time. So even though like in the moment you were escaping those, when I think back to that movie, those are like the experiences that I have. And so whenever I watch that movie in the future, uh, it changes that experience. Like now for me, when I watch Playtime, not only do I have the experience of watching it back in film school and actually like talking about it in film school and writing my one of my big essays on it. I also now have the experience of that was the first film that we show when we had the movie theater, and so now that kind of like right adjusts that experience. And so now when I watch it, like I have these kind of weird, bittersweet emotions that go with it. And that's the case with this too. I mean, I have a lot of different emotions and baggage that come with this piece. And yeah, even despite all that, even or because of all that, maybe I just admire this film so much. And Mike Nichols has long been one of my favorite directors. I mean, The Graduate, which was one of the, it was very early in our
Yeah, that was one of the
cast, I
first.
think.
Yeah, yeah.
It was one of the first movies we did. And the reason I picked
Yep.
it was because at the
It's
time it was
good.
one of my favorite movies of all time. And I still think it's a top 10 pick for me.
It's a good
And
movie.
yet this too is still, I mean, it's probably in the top 20 or 30 favorite films of all time, just because of everything that we talked about and that you talked about. And having Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor sort of expose themselves really in this very
They kill
raw
it.
and intense way is just so spectacular. And I cannot think of anything about this movie that I don't like, other than the fact, as we talked about, I think it sort of drags towards the end. And I think that's only because it is so propulsive and explosive at the beginning of this film that it's physically impossible to hold on to
Yeah.
that for the length of that film, right? It just can't be done. So that's not really a fault of anyone involved. I just don't think, I mean, it's an impossible task.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give this film a strong 9 out of 10.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. You can find everything I do at Austin Lugo.
I'm on Letterboxd at Retro Andrew, RETR0 Andrew.
And you can find this podcast wherever your podcasts. You also find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And with nothing to say, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much.